introduction, and thank you for inviting me to come and talk to you. I'm impressed by the turnout. Hope I can deliver something that's of interest to all of you. Let me start by saying a few more words about myself before I get into the sort of substance of what you're really interested in. As Anika says, I'm a research fellow at the Adaptation and Resilience, where my interests are largely in the areas of energy access, low carbon energy systems, poverty reduction, general issues to do with climate change and development, and particularly the relationship, at least to work at the moment, the relationship between climate change and international development goals and policy. I've been at ODI now for a bit over 2 years. Before that, I worked for many years for the NGO, the charity Practical Action, which some of you may have heard of, which is an organisation that focuses on the use of technology for poverty reduction, but taking a very strong emphasis on environmentally sound technologies as well as technologies that are appropriate to the conditions that people who are living in poverty have. And that's where I've covered everything, not just energy that I'm focusing on ODI, but agriculture, water, construction, you name it. So quite a broad range of technologies in quite a few countries. The Overseas Development Institute, for those of you who don't know it, is a think tank based in London that focuses on research and analysis on policy issues related to human development and humanitarian relief. The organisation operates as a kind of independent research institute, focusing on policy analysis particularly and trying to inform policy and decision making. So we don't do, if you like, operational work on the ground in developing countries, but we do a lot of support to people who do that kind of work, and of course a lot of interaction with decision makers and policy makers in developing countries. So, and our focus is on developing countries. In doing this work, we work with a range of partners, both governments in developing countries, donor governments, international organizations, and private sector companies. Some of the work that we do is work that we instigate and get funds for in order to provide evidence or analysis about key issues and challenges. And some of the work is also commissioned by those organizations to help them do their work. The organization's priorities fall into 5 broad areas. They're not completely independent of each other, they overlap a lot. So one area is really about the challenge of poverty eradication. The second one, building sustainable futures, is about environment and climate change, and that's the work that I primarily focus on, although I do work with some of the others. There's then a program of work that's really about the challenges of the poorest people in the world. Things to do with disasters, insecurity, social protection, and so on. And the area of work that then deals with institutions and governance and politics and how those processes and factors influence development. And then a final one, which is really sort of core economic questions of increasing productivity and creating jobs. And the work that we do follows all of that. I sit in the Environment and Climate Change Program, where our work divides into roughly 4 areas. One is a program of work that's looking at climate finance, both understanding the commitments that have been made, the disbursements that haven't been made, and trying to monitor those processes and get involved in both the institutions that are about the allocation of climate finance, but also now getting into work that's looking at how that finance is being used. The second area is about adaptation and resilience, with a very strong focus on work that's to do with disaster risk reduction, disaster preparedness, reducing the vulnerability of people in developing countries to the risks of disasters. The third area is a research program run by something called the Climate and Development Knowledge Network, CDKN, which is a huge international network of organizations. ODI is a part of that, and we manage the research program for that network. And then finally, there's an area of work which is still relatively new for ODI and relatively small compared to the others, which is around green growth and the sustainable management of natural resources for human and economic development. And again, that's the area that I work in. And then related to all of that, we've just recently instituted a kind of cross-organizational team that's focusing on green growth issues, and green growth being interpreted relatively broadly. The organization's got about 200 people in it, so there's a lot of research and brainpower going on there, and involved in a huge number of different pieces of research and projects. A lot of publications, somewhere between 200 and 300 publications come out of ODI every year. Most of those are on the website, which you'll be able to find without any problems, I imagine. So that's me and where I'm coming from, and all of that will condition the rest of what I'm going to talk about, which is really the challenge that we face of trying to introduce what are now called Sustainable Development Goals. That's a new set of international agreed goals for sustainable development. And I'll give you a little bit of background on that. First of all, starting off with a little bit more about the sort of general issue about sustainability and poverty reduction. Okay. Now, I understand from Anika that you come from a whole range of different departments and interests and probably levels of knowledge about environmental sustainability, climate change, and international development. So I'm going to sort of start by sketching out, in general terms, about the importance of the interdependence of environmental sustainability for equitable development and the eradication of poverty. Again, in the context of this process that the international community is engaged in terms of formulating sustainable development goals. Some of you will know sustainable development has been part of the lexicon of international development for more than 20 years, probably close to 30 years. And it really came to the fore at the first Rio conference in 1992, when sustainable development became more well defined for the international community and became integral to nearly every international policy debate, international policy document about poverty reduction in developed countries. But sustainable development also means different things to different people. It's interpreted very differently. So much so that sometimes it's just used as a phrase that really doesn't have very much meaning. And I would add, particularly for maybe for this audience, that I think green growth is a similar phrase. It means different things to different people, to the point where it sometimes isn't very clear what some people's using the phrase green growth and sustainable development really means. But even if sustainable development is now integral to debate and discourse, and to some extent of the policy actions about poverty reduction, it's clear that over those 20 years since it became mainstream, the state of the world's environment has got worse. Climate change is the most obvious environmental challenge that the world faces, but it's a lot broader than that. We also have issues across the world to do with water pollution, air pollution, not atmospheric air pollution, but particle emissions in urban areas, soil degradation and loss of biodiversity, a huge range of environmental challenges, in some localities extremely severe. And if you add all of that up, some of you may know it, the Millennium Ecosystem Assessment did this, it shows a pretty bleak picture. So although sustainable development is part of the policy discourse, the question is whether or not it's really, truly been adopted as a guide for policy. I would add here that for those people who are primarily focused on human development, on the essentials of providing basic services to poor people and enabling them to survive in very difficult circumstances, environmental sustainability is not a primary concern. In fact, it doesn't even enter into the thinking of many people who are focused specifically on humanitarian needs and on the basics of human development, such as education and health. The Millennium Development Goals, which some of you may also be familiar with, which were agreed in the year 2000 at the United Nations, set out 8 goals that have guided international development policy and the allocation of resources for the last 15 years. There is one goal in the Millennium Development Goals that's about the environment, something that's called the goal being to ensuring environmental sustainability, itself pretty vague. It's a goal that was added at the very last minute to the other goals, which somebody remembered to think about the environment in a process that was largely about human development. And it set up a number of targets which were pretty weak from an environmental point of view and pretty unambitious at that. For instance, the last target there to achieve improvement in the lives of 100 million slum dwellers was achieved within a period of 5 years, and the number of slum dwellers has more than doubled that. The increase in the number of slum dwellers has more than doubled that. So the Millennium Development Goal environmental target wasn't terribly useful, and there's a lot more progress that needs to be done if we're going to achieve environmental sustainability. And the challenge now, in the process of formulating what is going to replace the Millennium Development Goals in 2015, is to ensure that we have integrated into that set of goals all 3 dimensions of sustainable development: the economic, the social, and the environmental. Now, it remains to be seen whether that will happen. The discussions are still taking place to formulate those goals, and we won't have any idea what they're going to be until later this year, around about September. But there are 2 factors in the world that are quite different from when the Millennium Development Goals were formulated in 2000, which I think make introducing environmental sustainability into the new set of goals much more likely. And these are, firstly, population growth and income growth, and secondly, the challenge, the existential challenge of climate change. During the 20th century, the world's population increased by 4 times. The world's GDP increased by 23 times, meaning levels of consumption of that much larger population are that much higher. And all of this puts a great deal of pressure on natural resources, because there is very little consumption taking place that doesn't have some impact on natural resources. For instance, at the moment, around 2.7 billion people live in areas that are suffering water shortages. There are stresses on the water supply for nearly half the world's population. By 2025, it's going to be 2/3 of the world's population that lives in water-stressed areas. In most of the last decade, the world consumed more food than it produced. And food demand is projected to increase by 50% by 2030, the target year for the next set of development goals. In other words, this growing population, and admittedly population is expected to peak and flatten out in the middle of the century at around about 9 to 10 billion. But GDP is expected to, even despite the current slowdown that we're experiencing at the moment, GDP is expected to grow, and certainly all politicians and most of the world's population want GDP to grow. So the stresses and pressures on natural resources are going to continue. good reason to include sustainability into the next set of goals. As far as climate change is concerned, when the Millennium Development Goals were formulated, again in the year 2000, climate change was barely part of the discussion about international development. But we now know that climate change that is inevitable, let alone the climate change that might take place if emissions continue to increase, is going to make achieving any form of development, including the eradication of poverty, much more costly and much more challenging. In fact, many people would argue that the climate change actually threatens not just achievement of the next millennium, the next round of international development goals, but potentially threatens progress that has been achieved to date. So climate change, in addition to the obvious average temperature increase and the sea level rise that many of you will be familiar with, is going to impact food production. Crop yields are expected to decrease as temperature rises and water shortages appear and rainfall is disturbed. Disasters and extreme weather events, which particularly affect poor and vulnerable people, are expected to increase in frequency, but also in intensity. And then climate change also has more indirect effects through, for instance, increasing the range of vector-borne diseases such as malaria, increasing the disruption to people's lives, their increasing intensity of means, which means that their livelihoods get disrupted, their education gets disrupted, and they find it much more difficult to get out of poverty. So climate change and development, human development, are inextricably linked. Actions and interventions that are geared towards human development, and a lot of that is about economic growth, but also social development, have an impact on the climate. And climate change has an impact on those development processes. All of that is actually now recognized by the international community, and certainly the discussions that are taking place to formulate the next set of goals have recognized that. What we don't know yet is quite how that recognition is going to get translated into targets and goals to address these questions. So let me give you a few examples of the sorts of things that can make a difference and the sorts of things that the new round of international development goals ought to be trying to foster and encourage. I've taken 4 examples, and because ODI doesn't have operational work on the ground itself, I'm taking 4 examples from the research, well, 3 examples from the research program of the Climate and Development Knowledge Network, and 1 example of a piece of work I did myself last year. First of all, let's think about disaster risk reduction. Climate change is increasing the frequency of extreme weather events. It's making disasters more likely. In Bangladesh, a country which is perhaps more than most highly conscious of the effects of climate change on its development pathway, in Bangladesh, every year, something like 10 million people are affected by natural hazards. It could be cyclones, it could be droughts, it could be floods, it could be river erosion. In Bangladesh, it could also sometimes be earthquakes. So there's a range of natural hazards that the country faces that affect large numbers of people. In 1991, one of the worst cyclones they experienced killed a total of 140,000 people and made millions of people homeless. This prompted the government to start doing something about it. And they prepared something that's called their Comprehensive Disaster Management Program. This is a program that wasn't just looking at individual types of disasters, such as cyclones, but trying to cover all types of hazard. The approach they took was first to develop a policy framework and a planning system that reached down to district level to enable people to prepare for hazards and to reduce disaster risks. What they did was set up also a disaster management information center using quite modern technology. If you ever get a chance to look at it, there's a really fancy website that shows the forecast, the weather patterns. They have an early warning system that uses mobile telephones to warn people in high-risk areas when hazards are likely to occur. With the result that in 2007, Cyclone Sidr, of a similar intensity to the one in 1991, there were only 4,000 deaths. Still maybe 4,000 deaths too many, but a vastly reduced number. One of the components of the Bangladesh Comprehensive Disaster Management Program was an initiative about community risk assessments. This was about building capacity within individual communities to assess their own risks to environmental hazards. And then the government provided funding for them to be able to take initiatives, make investments, which could be building bunds, it could be building drainage, it could be cyclone shelters. And the government gave them funds to implement activities that would reduce that community's risks to disasters. And then the final component of the program was an overall capacity building program, both focusing on the capacity of government officials to be able to serve this new planning system for disaster risk, and also local government and local community capacities to be able to undertake these kinds of risk assessments and the identification of initiatives to reduce disaster risk. That's now a fairly familiar form of behavior in countries that have high risks of disasters, so areas that have high risk of natural disasters. It's not everywhere yet, but it's increasingly common. And Bangladesh's model is one that I think a lot of countries are looking to. The second example of the kind of initiative that makes a difference is about increasing people's resilience and capacity to adapt to climate change. And here the example is focusing on the challenge faced by indigenous peoples. In this case, it's about indigenous people in Bolivia, where there's a large number of, or a large proportion of the population comes from indigenous communities, who are particularly vulnerable to the impacts of climate change, both because they are poor, they have very few assets, they have very few livelihood opportunities, but also because the livelihoods that they do have are highly dependent on the use of natural resources. So the impact of climate change on natural resources is going to affect them severely. The challenge that many of these communities face is that their traditional ways of being able to forecast climatic events, the weather, rainfall, frosts, and so on, are no longer working for them because of the changing climate. They find that seasonal change, when it's going to take place, is increasingly harder to predict. For example, one kind of community, the Chikaya people in the higher plateaus, monitor the wind, the clouds, and frosts in order to predict the weather that then enables them to make decisions, informed decisions, about when they should be planting or when they should be harvesting. There's another community that uses almost a form of stargazing, and that might sound pretty weird, to stargazing to forecast the timing and the quantity of rains. The point being that the clarity of them being able to see the stars, the clarity of the stars in the sky, is an indicator for them of the time and the quantity of rains that are going to come. Again, rainfall, agriculture, an extremely important piece of information. As well as the challenge of the increasing unreliability of these traditional indicators because the climate is becoming unpredictable, there's also social processes in place that mean traditional forms of transferring traditional knowledge are also breaking down. And nothing really is replacing that. So the initiative in Bolivia was to try and bring together the traditional indigenous knowledge about these climate indicators, together with scientific weather forecasting and climate forecasting, in order to provide a much more reliable information system about the weather, about rains, about frosts, and so on, that would enable people to continue to be able to produce from their fields. Part of this process was also providing scientific validation of the traditional knowledge. This is probably something that the scientists wanted more than the indigenous communities. But that validation meant that the scientists gave credence to the traditional methods and were much more able to integrate them into their own more Western, if you like, scientific ways of thinking. All of this is about then integrating that knowledge and providing information about the weather, particularly to enable people to farm in an efficient and productive way. The third example, again focusing on adaptation, but here is an interesting example of the link between actions that mitigate against climate change, i.e. reduce emissions, and actions that enable people to adapt to climate change. And the example here is from Fiji, although the basic principles apply in many countries that have significant forests. Again, the point being that a large proportion of emissions is something like, I can't remember the exact figure, but it's about 15-20% of emissions are from land use change. And a lot of that land use change is about deforestation for agricultural purposes. And countries which have significant areas under forest, and in Fiji's case, 61% of the land is forested. There's increasing pressure on that forest for agricultural purposes in order to meet these other challenges that I was talking about earlier of providing enough food for people and providing enough incomes for people. But the point the approach that Fiji took there was to recognize that actions to reduce deforestation, in other words, mitigation actions, reducing deforestation, which both reduces emissions but also increases the capacity to sequester carbon from the atmosphere, also have impacts in terms of people's ability to adapt to climate change. Forests provide opportunities for income, they provide watershed protection, they mitigate against floods, they mitigate against droughts, and I think the example from the picture here, they also provide coastal protection from the sea and high waves and storms from the sea. So actions that are about mitigation have an adaptation benefit. One of the interesting aspects from the Fiji case here is that the adaptation initiatives that they're trying to do, which have these human development, social development benefits, are being, or the idea is that they be funded from funding, climate change funding, that is coming from something called REDD+. I don't know if any of you have heard of REDD+, but REDD+ means reduced emissions from deforestation and forest degradation. The plus is the degradation bit, which is a proposed, it's not yet actually active, channel of funding that for investment in mitigation activities. And the idea that Fiji adopted here was to, well, let's get ready to accept these funds for mitigation activities, but recognize that they also have adaptation benefits. They also thought that this is a good way to help get funding into their forestry sector, since it's actually relatively underfunded. So here's an example of how you can both achieve mitigation and adaptation through this kind of work. Now the final example here is from Uganda, although renewable energy is an issue for most countries. But I think the challenge here has been that in countries like Uganda, more so even than in the past because they're beginning to grow quite quickly, there is a huge lack of electricity. Something like 10% of the country's population have access to electricity. And those people who do have access have very unreliable electricity because there's just not enough of it, even for the numbers that are connected. So there's a big challenge here to invest in increasing the generation capacity in the country, coupled with a country that has very few resources to do it. Now, in a country like Uganda, renewable energy isn't really a problem. It's a country that has hydropower potential. And one of the approaches that they've adopted is to try and promote small hydropower projects. And the instance here is a project I looked at last year, which is a 50 megawatt hydropower plant in western Uganda. The interesting part of the initiative, at least for me, was that this is a purely private sector funded project. In other words, it's an ability to overcome the challenge that the government has of not having enough of its own resources to invest in generation capacity. But providing a framework now that allows private sector investors to invest in build and operate small hydropower projects that then sell their power to the grid at an agreed rate. And in this case, also the company involved, which actually the company here is a subsidiary of a Norwegian company, which is called Tronder Energy, which is a sort of social enterprise owned by a number of municipal authorities in Norway. So they were very socially aware. But they also decided not only to invest in the power station here, but they also wanted to use emission savings to get carbon credits as revenue for the company. And because they're a socially aware, socially responsible business, they also provided some funds for local electrification within the local community to be able to increase the levels of access to electricity in Uganda. And there are numerous examples of this kind of renewable energy project now in many parts of the world, particularly where obviously the hydropower resource is there. So those are four relatively small examples of the sorts of things that sustainable development needs to be promoting and delivering. They provide human development, economic development, they provide environmental sustainability, they help combat the challenge of climate change. Something that the Climate and Development Knowledge Networks calls climate compatible development. So a triple win approach: human development, mitigation, and adaptation. But they're quite small initiatives, and the real challenge that we all face now is how to scale up the kinds of investments and allocations of funds in order to go into these sustainable projects. And that's what the Sustainable Development Goals need to try and deliver. I was asked to sort of mention a little bit about the sort of technology involved in here, but I think it's been clear that all of these projects involve technology. But part of the interesting challenge here, in terms of particularly sustainable development, is that we're talking about not just the sort of hardware-type technologies that renewable energy projects have, but the software-type technologies that disaster risk reduction planning might entail. and it's the soft technologies that sometimes are just the hard technologies. But as I say, the challenge is how to scale these up, and what kind of framework of international development goals is going to enable and encourage national governments and donors and subnational organisations, municipal authorities and local governments, and the private sector to invest and promote these kinds of initiatives, ones that truly integrate the social, the environmental, and the economic, all three dimensions of sustainable development. I'll stop there. Thank you very much, and we'll open up to any questions you have.
Thanks very much for the presentation. If anybody has any questions, they can ask now or wait till the end and call us guys. Thank you very much.
Let's take two or three and then something.
It seems the idea works on very grassroots level initiatives. Do work on a wider scale economically within with different government institutions and so on to kind of try and build capacity and foster more sustainable attitudes towards development. Or is it very grassroots based and that's seen as a way of transferable initiatives?
Okay, let's take two or three.
Can you tell us more about the small hydropower projects?
Okay.
And I have a question concerning the idea of resilience in phosphorus production. And there's been recent research associating the idea of resilience with the neoliberal thought of people being responsible for their self-help and etc. And whether you see resilience as being communities helping themselves to reduce the effects of climate change, or as a state-based policy.
Okay, interesting questions. I think the first and the third one is slightly connected. Let me deal with the Uganda one, to some extent it's easiest for me. I'm not quite sure what you wanted there. I'm not an engineer, so I can't tell you all the ins and outs of the engineering part of it. This is a 15 megawatt hydropower, run-of-river hydropower plant in western Uganda. There are actually three other hydropower plants on the same river. One or two of them quite old. It was built. Let me see. I visited it a year ago, and it has been operating for nearly 2 years then. So it's been running for about 3 years now. The investment finance came from Tronder Energy with some funds from a Norwegian financing house called Nordfund, and some finance from something that the UK government puts money into as a kind of investment vehicle called the Private Infrastructure Development. It's a pretty straightforward project from most points of view because it generates electricity and it sells it to the grid. That sale is through what we call a power purchase agreement that sets a fixed price. And that price is quite often the key determinant about whether or not the investor feels that the project is going to be financially rewarding. The company gets a concession for about 20-25 years to run this plant, and then after that they have to either move off or hand it over to the government or renegotiate. Pretty standard sort of practice, and it's a relatively straightforward technology. As part of this, the project, they have to build a transmission line to connect to the grid. The main consumer, actually, of the power of this power from this plant is a company called Hema Cement. One of the interesting features of it is that because the Ugandan grid is so unreliable, they have load shedding every day, sometimes for 12 hours a day. So power cuts are very frequent. But with this project, they set up a kind of mini grid in the locality, which means that when the rest of the grid goes down, this can still operate and still supply the local community through the local grid. Because the grid going down tends to be not enough power from other power stations, or the transmission lines are broken. It's not directly, other than that little mini-grid scenario, it's not directly feeding the local community, although one of the interesting features of it was that during the construction, they did a lot of training of people from the local community, and it employs 30-odd people from the local community. Very, really quite a simple project. I honestly can't remember what the cost was. But it wasn't enormous. It was pretty reasonable. I think one of the interesting points here is that small hydropower like this per unit of output tends to be a bit more expensive than large hydropower. But it only takes a year or so to build it, whereas large hydropower sometimes takes 10 years to get through the planning process.
Yes. From the ecological point of view, I think and also to scale up small hydropower projects involve the creation of the environmental impact.
This project did do an environmental impact assessment. They have one member of staff also who continuously monitors the environmental impact, which is actually unusual for a lot of these kind of companies. That's because, as I say, the investor is kind of socially aware of the enterprise. So they did do that. And the environmental impact, I mean, obviously, that every time you build something like that, there's an environmental impact of some kind. But it's not vast. I mean, it's not hugely significant. And partly because it's run a river, there's no dam. There's a canal that takes the water that goes back into the river, and it doesn't make all. So it's pretty. From an environmental point of view, it's as sound as you can get, I think, when it comes to the scale of energy production. Coming back to the other two questions. Are these kind of projects grassroots? Well, I think you'll have seen that this is not a grassroots project. This is a commercial investment, but with a social benefit. Some of the other things I was talking about, like the indigenous knowledge aspect and maybe community risk assessments in Bangladesh, are a bit more grassroots orientated. But again, I think, particularly if you think about the Bangladesh example, the point there that the government were trying to do was to say this, which perhaps goes back a little bit to your point, question, which is that the government can't do everything. And what is needed in many cases is a local assessment of the local risk, because many times the actual risk is very specific to a particular locality because of its geography or layout or where it is and so on. But also when it comes to who's going to be taking action when the hazard starts coming, it's got to be the local community. So part of the process that Bangladesh went through was to try and develop capacity at the community level to do the planning, but also to link to the government so that the government could provide resources to the kinds of risk reduction investments that the community identified. And I think that kind of approach, where you're linking up a degree of, if you like, control and initiative at the community level to a, if you like, a support system of institutions and finance through local government and national government level, can work pretty well for these sorts of projects, these locally managed, locally identified and environmentally sustainable projects. Now, is resilience a neoliberal concept? Well, that's an essay somewhere. And there's a huge debate in the resilience community about what resilience actually is. I mean, go to the Stockholm Resilience Centre or some stuff they're looking at it. It's science. It's nothing to do with politics. Other people might take a different view, but the whole point of the resilience concept, though, is to sort of say, well, shocks and disasters are going to happen. There's a certain amount that you can do to reduce the risk of them happening through types of investments, through being prepared, and so on, or certain mitigation factors that you can do to reduce the impact of them. But the point of the resilience is to be able to identify the sorts of things that you need to do to enable you to recover from that shock as quickly as possible. Now, I mentioned in Bangladesh that the number of deaths from a cyclone are reducing because of their disaster preparedness. Some of you may remember last year there was a huge cyclone in India, in the region of Andhra Pradesh, on the coast there, and all in the news, probably television screens were there. It was certainly in the news box. Some of you may remember that. And part of that news story was that nobody died. Very few people died as a result of that huge cyclone. People were moved out in time, and so on. So the human losses were very limited. Economic losses were enormous. The resilience part is saying, well, it's to enable people to, how do you recover as quickly as possible from that economic shock? And that means thinking in terms of market systems, or the loan, or you need to pay it back, and sometimes they can't even afford the electricity. In a lot of countries, you find that there is financial support available for that. I've just been looking recently at what's going on in Brazil. And in Brazil, they have a program called Luz para Todos, which is enabling poorest people to connect to the grid. Those people have to be recognized as being people living below the poverty line. Then you get a connection, and then you have to reduce tariff in the first 50 kilowatt hours.
Are they looking into expanding that into
well, I think people are looking at Brazil's approach as a model for other countries. The challenge in a country like, I suppose most countries in East Africa are the focus of the policymakers when it gets to electrification is about making sure that the middle classes in urban areas have the power rather than, and that's politics, before people in remote areas. Let's take one more, and then we'll come back to the repeats. Yeah.
It's not really a question, but it's just a general statement in regards to the whole of power situation in East Africa and everything, and the climate change and resilience. I think, like, having grown up there, the most problem is it's like with climate change, it's the lack of rainfall in which most of the electricity companies depend on, with the dams and everything. So what you see is every year there's less rainfall, which means less power, and the whole rationing of electricity. And you are right as far as they give the power to the most wealthy areas because those are the people who pay. And in places like rural sites and very other places, most of their electricity, or the only way that they get electricity is from, let's say, organizations and NGOs who work with solar companies, and so then they have these very different projects, and so a lot of there's been an increase in solar power, these little gadgets of lights and these little things that don't cost much, but when they're distributed to little families, they help, bring in power and provide light. So it's kind of the change in the climate is affecting how power is distributed, and every year, the prices go up, and it affects those people at the people at the bottom, but they can't afford the people who get cut off first. And I think at the moment, with power, they can probably during the day there's no power. If at first there's no power because there's daylight, but at night you need the power because for security reasons.
Well, I mean, first of all, you're absolutely right. I mean, hydropower is not the only form of renewable energy, but it is the one that is probably the most developed in terms of the technology, and probably the most widely used. And you're right, climate change is going to impact on the hydropower resource of any country. Very few countries yet have really done anything to try and assess what that impact is going to be and what action they therefore need to take to mitigate against it. One action, in my view, is that instead of thinking of a small number of large dams, they should be thinking of a larger number of smaller hydropower plants to diffuse the risk, if you like. So solar power is very important. As an option and relatively cope, but it only does provide light.
But there's also like an emergence of geothermal power right now.
In Kenya.
Or across the rifts.
Well, in Kenya, there's no country that's really done anything right. The other, you'll be starting to invest, the others are beginning to invest. It's not really operational thing like this. But yes, in the Rift Valley, certainly it's a large possibility. This side of the room.
Okay. Thanks very much. I was wondering, to the extent that the Sustainable Development Goals have been developed and created, what role does energy access play in that? And if it has it's played a role, to what extent is there a focus on renewable energy?
At the moment, what's on the table is to have a goal on sustainable energy for all. You've probably heard of the UN Sustainable Energy for All initiative, which has 3 targets: universal access to electricity by 2030, doubling the proportion of renewables in the global energy mix by 2030, and doubling or reducing by half, I think, the rate of improvement in energy efficiency. Most of that is likely to be in the gold package. So, to the extent that where it's talking about renewable energy, there's clearly a message about doubling the proportion of renewable energy in the global energy mix. Whether that's enough is a debatable point. And also, if that's a global target, it's not necessarily a bit like the European Union just decided. It's not necessarily a national level target. So it remains to be seen what actually happens. But there's a strong likelihood that it's going to be there in time.
So, yeah, but what would be specific examples of this is implemented on a national level? Because I think there must be a lot of countries for which it is much cheaper to just go to like traditional energies like brown coal or something like that. That must happen a lot in like these developed countries. So how is the UN pushing that, or how can you try to reduce the percentage of traditional fossil fuels in these countries that just can't afford to invest more in?
That's the challenge. One of the challenges of the Sustainable Development is the challenge of the UNFCCC. Sustainable Development Goals are going to set a number of sort of national, global goals and targets. Individual countries are going to be asked to then define their own targets towards these goals. We don't know whether that's going to add up to what's going to be necessary from the point of view of environmental sustainability. And certainly in many countries we say, well, we'll just go for the cheapest power source that's available. Brown coal. In East Africa, it's gas. But we don't know. On the other hand, some countries, particularly including some of the large emitters like China, have set themselves quite ambitious targets to increase the proportion of renewables. So it's not completely easy picture. Shall we? One more question. What time do you finish? One more question at the back, and then we'll come back to the.
Can I ask, in terms of renewable energy, in terms of sources like biofuels, has it been implemented in all the countries? I mean, obviously there's a unproportional ratio of renewable energy sources there as well. What's your opinion on
Well, we've got 2 types of biofuels. We've got biodiesel and ethanol. In Brazil, ethanol is the fuel for vehicles because they've invested in it, they've developed the capacity to produce it. So, one or two countries, ethanol has taken off, guided very much by a government policy framework and set of incentives. Biodiesel, by and large, in developing countries, is pretty small scale. It's in many countries it's little more than a pilot level. It might be producing some fuel, whether or not that's used locally, I don't know. Where it's being produced on a large scale, it's really for export to Europe because of the incentives here. So it's a little bit mixture. So and that fuel tends to be where it's really working at scale. It tends to be palm oil in coastal zones with environmental impacts, both in terms of the use of the land or the use of the water resource, but also in terms of the pollution. So, at the moment, it's in developing countries, certified diesel is not really an energy source that many people are thinking seriously about. One more question. Good. Let's take one who hasn't asked me. You can come and talk to me afterwards.
I just wanted to touch when you mentioned RED as a mechanism to attract finance for forestry. I just want to know how you might see that developing, because at the moment it's been a bit of a flop. First, because how can you really ascertain that it can't be chopped down somewhere else, or how do you know it's going to be chopped down at all? So I just wanted to see what your thoughts were.
Personally, I'm sceptical about RED. First of all, it's a question of whether the money is going to be made available in the first place. You then got this huge challenge of, as you pointed out, of verifying and monitoring. And it's actually quite, well, you obviously know, pretty complicated to be able to assess what the carbon storage of the forest is going to be. Even more complicated if it's going to give us new plant. And that there are initiatives taking place that are about building capacity of countries to be ready for RED. In other words, that's about the capacities to do this monitoring, verification, the channeling of the finance to the investments and so on. So there's work taking place that is getting ready for it. But that obviously isn't going to actually make any difference until there's any significant money available for RED. And that hasn't happened yet. That tends to be public. Well, it will tend to be public. The commercial proposition for RED is also pretty small, I think. Probably less, slightly less than renewable energy investments. Simply because it's a high-risk investment. And so any commercial investors will want a pretty high return. And I'm not sure that's going to be viable in most forestry sectors. Okay, thank you very much for your questions. Really interesting to hear what you have to say.